whether it's a steel production, whether it's a network, telecommunication network, all of these have common properties that we need to understand. It was called general system theory. It was debunked for a while. Now it's understood that he really was describing, in a more inclusive sense, all of these things that we have in chaos, complexity, and nonlinear dynamics. There's a subset of system theory that's just emerging called network theory. How many have heard of 6 degrees of separation? And what's it about? Anybody? The 6 degrees of separation. Where'd the idea come from?
6 degrees of separation, Kevin Bacon. How many?
Well, Kevin Bacon in terms of the movies, but where'd the original idea or the discovery come from? Okay. A gentleman named Stanley Milgram, Milgram, I think it was Harvard. He took, he had this idea, and he mailed 160 letters, or actually to mail them, he had 160 letters in Kansas, Nebraska that he gave to 160 different people and said, I want you to get this letter to this stockbroker in Boston. Now, I know you don't know him, but I want you to pick somebody you think might have some ability to get this to him. And they did, and a good portion of the letters arrived, and when you average it out, the average number of people it went through was 6. It only took 6 people from Nebraska and Kansas for these letters to get. They've run a lot of, and somebody said, well, 200 plus million people in the United States, that's unusual, but maybe not that unusual. Even when they've run the experiment with the world, over 2 billion people, there's only 6 degrees of separation between all of us. And so it begins to talk about network theory. Now, this is what, when Malcolm Gladwell is talking about mavens and so forth, and in his book, he's really talking about network theory. And I've got another book up here if you want to follow it. I find it just absolutely intriguing. Now, you didn't all ask me to come in here and give you a science lecture. You asked me to come in here and talk about command and control, about decision making. I wanted to give you the context. The context in which you make decisions reside on these theories. What about Blink? Well, Blink, it's recognitional decision making or intuitive decision making, and really it's the same thing. Intuition had a bad rap. So those scientists, those who've studied it, were going to say, well, I'm talking about how people do things with their intuition, so they talked about recognitional decision making, but it's really the same thing. So these 2 books are interesting. In fact, they've been on the bestseller list together for a long time. In fact, the only one I know who's got 2 books on the bestseller list. Howard Gardner, who's a noted psychologist from Harvard, did a book review on Blink for the Washington Post. And I think he offers an interesting idea that I'm going to try to at least take a first stab at today. He says Blink differs from the tipping point, which could draw on complexity theory, network theory, and already developed analytical frameworks. So he was saying, even if you read Tipping Point, you don't know about those theories. That's what Malcolm Gladwell is drawing upon. But he says, the reason Blink differs is we don't have those well-developed theories underpinning it. And decision-making theory, real decision-making theory, not some of this hokey stuff that's out there, is relatively new. And I'll give you a couple of references I think you need to take a look at later. So he says, as a final challenge, I suggest that Gladwell attempt to integrate his conclusions about intuition and tipping points into a single account. Should he succeed, he will have achieved a milestone of his own development and in the process served as an impressive role model for future science writers. So he's saying take these ideas of nonlinear dynamics and intuitive decision-making and bring them, synthesize them into something higher. I'm going to make a rude attempt to do that for you here this morning. I want to explain systems again in 2 ways. I want to talk about structurally complex systems, which have very complex, elaborate structures, but within those structures, there's not very much freedom of action. And I want to talk about interactively complex systems, which may or may not have a complex structure, but all of the piece parts have a lot of movement, a lot of freedom. The first are generally mechanical. And we know that if I was to cut a fuel line to these jet engines, in every case, what's going to happen? Very structurally complex, but we will get the same result in a short period of time if I do it. In fact, if a structurally complex system had a lot of freedom of movement or freedom of action, it would malfunction. And that's what happens in machinery or engineered networks. But ecologies represent interactively complex. And what we don't know, if we take this particular little frog out of this ecological system, what's going to happen? And all of you are familiar, many disasters when we've either introduced something or taken it away. Structurally complex systems can be understood and problems with them solved with Newtonian physics, a Newtonian understanding of the world. Ecological cannot. So our difficulty with this operational net assessment was that the Joint Forces Command was trying to use Newtonian physics for interactively complex systems rather than something different. Okay, let me pause just for a second, and I don't want to lose anybody as I sometimes start to preach. I get excited about this. So any questions at this point before we move along? Okay. Sometimes folks say to me, well, General, you just don't understand. When computers are big enough, we will be able to tackle these interactively complex systems and solve them. And I say to them, no, you don't understand. Let's take something that's interactively complex, relatively simple, 64 squares, 32 pieces, it's bounded, can't jump off the board, you got to stay on the board. If you looked at your notes there, how many potential moves are there at the beginning of a chess game? Well, the answer is 10 to the power of 128. I don't know what that means, maybe you don't. Easiest way to think it, 10 to the power of 80 is the number of atoms in the universe. So there are more potential moves in a chess game at the beginning than there are atoms in the universe. Another way to think about it, if the two players made one move every microsecond, in other words, they're making 1,000 moves a second between the two of them. Each one gets 500 moves in a second. And they played over the course of the history of the universe, some 12 to 13 billion years, they would not exceed the number of moves. Now, tell me what computer system's ever going to solve this? How did Big Blue do it? Because as you play the game, obviously, the potential moves go away. And there are some moves that are nonsense. If you understand the game, you'd never make the move. So it understands the nonsense moves, and as it goes down, eventually, it's computable. But at the outset, it's not. How much more complicated is life? How much more complicated is business? How much more complicated is war than a doggone chessboard? So let's forget the computers for trying to solve problems. Computers help you do the analysis, but they can't solve the problems. Artificial intelligence is bogus. I'm going to ask this computer, I want the dog in the window. I want the dog in the window. Everybody knows what I'm saying. But if you think about it grammatically, I could want the window. I want the dog in the window. Well, if any language you translate that, it could come out, I want the window, but we know that I'm talking about the dog.